Hi, everybody. I, I'm Patrick Ryan. I'm the author of Buckeye. I want to say thank you for everybody for being here at this incredible seminar. Thank you to Arlo and to David and to Katie and to all the many, many people it takes to put something like this together. I feel honored to stand here in front of everyone. Buckeye is set in a small Midwest town. It spans 6 decades, and it tells the story of how two families' lives become intertwined by one bad decision and one giant secret. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about how the book came about, but I thought first I would tell you a little bit about how I got to the point where I was writing this book, a little bit of my own trajectory. I became serious about writing, or about wanting to be a writer, when I was 16. That year, I wrote a sequel to The Empire Strikes Back. Just in case you don't know, that was a sequel itself based on a very popular science fiction movie. What I wrote was not a screenplay, it was more like a novelization of my vision of what the sequel to The Empire Strikes Back might be. So I wrote this all out, and then I wrote a letter to George Lucas, and I explained to him that I had written this, and assuming he was hard up for ideas, I offered to show him this. I sent this letter certified, by the way. I offered to show this to him, and that he could use my ideas on the understanding that, yes, they were his characters, but these situations were mine, and as long as he was willing to sign over, rights. I did not hear back. I still have the manuscript, and I have to tell you how tempted I was to bring it today and just read from it for half an hour. I just thought that would be so awesome. But I will recite for you the first 3 sentences, and I'm going to do it in that impressive way that poets and sometimes prose writers do, where they just look up from the page and look out at the audience and recite their prose from memory. This is the first 3 sentences. Luke Skywalker thought that his day couldn't get any worse. Or was it night? It was hard to tell in space. Thank you. I always dreamed of getting applause for that particular work. I wrote my first novel when I was 22 years old. I wasn't really sure what to do with it, but I knew enough that I had to send out copies, so I took it to Kinko's. I made lots of copies. I mailed them out to editors and agents, both. I had no idea. Thinking that, somebody might bite. And as those of us who are old enough to remember, in those days, you'd get your manuscript back, and the top and the bottom would be all mangled, and you would take those pages and make fresh papers and put them on top, and hope that they hadn't sort of written their rejection across the first page, which I always thought was like going on a blind date with somebody and they would just write "no thanks" on your forehead. But if you remember the Waltons, those of us of a certain age remember the Waltons, and you remember what happened to John Boy? John Boy was a writer, and all through that whole series, he was writing his novel, and then he finished the novel, and he mailed it to a publisher in New York, and he didn't hear anything, so he got on the train and went to New York. And he went to the publisher's door, and he said, "Look, there it is, wrapped up. I sent it to you. Will you please read it?" And she said, "All right, I'll read it this weekend. Come back on Monday morning." So John Boy went out that weekend and did things none of us have ever found out what happened that weekend to John Boy in New York City. But he came back Monday morning, and she loved it, and she wanted to publish it. So the following year, I took about 4 copies of my manuscript to New York. And this was back in the days when you could walk into a building and just find the directory and get in the elevator and go up and ring the bell. And I handed my manuscript to, I think, 4 different agents who gave me very bewildered looks. And I did not gain an agent that way. But by then I had started another novel, and I thought, this is going to be the one. And that one ended up being the one that I was sending around while I started the next one, which became the one that I was sending around while I started the next one. And it went on like that for a long time. And over the years, I finished and revised and sent around and then ultimately sentenced to the vault 7 novels that never saw the light of day. And I also started, of course, this is the way things always go, I started about 6 or 7 more and got about 100 or 200 pages in, and those didn't work out, and I tossed them. But while I know this might sound pathetic, and for those of you out there who are emerging writers, I find that term really funny because it makes us like prairie dogs. We're emerging writers. I want to say that I don't mean for it to sound discouraging. There was an upside in all of this, and part of it was that writing became a practice for me, and it actually became the closest thing I'll ever have to a sport, which was great. So 15 years of living this way went by. I was writing for anywhere from a half hour to 3 hours a day in the morning, always, depending on how much time I had while I worked various jobs. No book, no book, no book. In my mid-30s, I'm at a Buddhist retreat. I'm sitting on this large flat rock at the highest lake in the Catskills, and I'm meditating, and I put that in quotes because what I was really doing was sitting there trying to talk myself into quitting. I just thought, give this up. This is just clearly not working for you. But it was kind of like when I was a teenager and I was trying to wish myself straight. It just wasn't feasible because it wasn't what I really wanted. I didn't know who I was if I wasn't a writer. So I sat there with my eyes still closed and I thought, okay, if I don't quit writing, what lies ahead for me? Let's say I live to be 85 and I never publish a book. I write my whole life, novel after novel, while I teach composition and paint houses and walk dogs and refill coffees and pour cocktails and carry out prime ribs and take office supply orders and enter data and proofread legal documents and jump up and down in a dumpster of a Pier 1 import in my dress shoes trying to flatten boxes because it was the days before we recycled. Let's say I do that for my whole life and I keep writing and I never publish a book. What then? That is the burning question for every emerging writer who doesn't just emerge right away. I saw 2 options. I could conclude at 85 years old that my life of pursuing writing had been a huge waste of time, a pipe dream, pathetic, embarrassing, etc. Or I could conclude that I had done all that because I wanted to do it because I enjoyed writing. So the first answer to the question was unacceptable to me. It had to be the second answer. I would have to conclude, looking back on my life, that I had done all that because I enjoyed it. So I thought, I might as well conclude that now. Now meaning me at 35 years old. I might as well conclude that now and carry on from there. It's the closest I've ever come in my life to having an epiphany. So sitting there on that rock, I let go of the idea of the prize. And when I opened my eyes, there was a large snake sitting next to me, and 3 little snakes sitting next to that snake. I'm just throwing that in because how could I not include that detail? But I got up and ran screaming back to the monastery. I guess there's a metaphor. I don't know what the metaphor would be. The day after I got back from the monastery, I started writing what turned out to become my first book. It was a collection of short stories. It got accepted by Random House. It came out when I was 40. And it sold hundreds of copies. The next year, Edmund White, dear friend to so many of us, and dearly missed, Ed regrettably and wryly, in that Ed way, told me that he wasn't able to nominate me for 20 Under 40 because I'd aged out. Just like this. We've aged out. I told him that was fine with me because I was waiting to make somebody's 70 under 90 list. And I still am, by the way. If you hear of one, please keep my name in mind. I then resumed my quest to write a novel, and I kept writing short stories. And on 3 different whims, I sat down and I wrote 3 books for young adults. And they actually found publishers, all 3 of them, and sold tens of copies. and are now out of print and banned in many southern states. I wrote a whole nother novel after that that went into the vaults because it didn't work out. And I published a second collection of short stories. Around this time, early 50s, I found out from my aunt that my grandmother on my dad's side, I had grown up in Florida, but my dad's whole side of the family was from this very small town in Ohio. So my Ohio grandmother, who was a very unpleasant person, she was very pious and judgmental. She loved to say mean things about people and start fights. She died in the middle of an argument that she started. So very much in the saddle, very, fighting the good fight. I found out from my aunt that this grandmother, living in that tiny town, had had an affair with a married man living down the street for decades. It had started in the 1940s. And there's nothing terribly original about that as a sin, so to speak, but it was very mind-blowing to me because it just didn't fit any picture that I could remember of her, this person who was now long gone. And I saw the kernel for something in there that I might write. I knew I didn't want to write about her as a person. I knew I didn't want to write about a prolonged affair, but I thought I would attempt a short novel that was sort of sparked by that discovery, a short novel about a young married woman living in a small town in Ohio whose husband is off fighting World War II, who has a fling with a young man who, for some reason I wasn't sure then what it would be, is not off fighting the war. And because all I'd ever published in the world of grown-up writing were short stories in literary magazines, and clearly the short form was my comfort zone, I thought, this is probably going to be a very short novel, maybe even a novella. I always begin with the characters, and as soon as I started taking notes on these two characters that I wanted to bring together and have them meet and have this fling, I immediately became curious about who these people were married to and whether or not they had children and who had raised them. I immediately started seeing this expand in my mind. And I'm drawn to ideas in general for stories about people who have really good reasons for doing the regrettable things that they do, and then what follows. What do we do with our regret? What do we do when asking for forgiveness isn't enough, or when bestowing forgiveness is not enough? What comes next? And the novel that took shape in my head and in my notes stretched for 3 generations and spanned 6 decades. So I had to figure out the best way to tell that. I didn't want to write it in first person because no one character knew the whole story, so that wasn't really an option. I did not want to write it in multiple first-person voices because that is not my happy place as a writer. I love reading it, but it's just not the way my brain works. So I knew it had to be in third person. If you don't mind my nerding out to Olympic proportions for just a minute, the way I'd always done that up till then was when it came to a third-person narrator was when it was going to switch perspectives, I would just put in a section break, a nice, safe little section break. And I didn't want to do that in this book. There's nothing wrong with that kind of writing, and it's the way I've always written. But I sort of felt in my gut that the most interesting, most explosive and deep-diving way to tell this story was to do it in the third person with an omniscient narrator who could just flow from person to person, character to character, who could pull back and comment. So this was kind of an oh shit moment for me, because not only had I never worked on anything this long, I'd never worked on anything this vast, I had never even attempted an omniscient narrator, not even in private. I had not even done it myself just to throw it away. It was the holy grail. It is the holy grail of fiction for me. And I just knew that it was the way to go. So I gave myself a pep talk. I thought, this is a pretty good idea for a novel. If only it were in someone else's hands. If only it were in a better writer's hands. That's my version of a pep talk. And then I berated myself for thinking that because it was my idea after all. And by that point, I had a 3-ring binder of notes on the characters and their trajectories. And while I don't like to think about theme when I write, because then it dictates some of the decisions that I make, I could see themes emerging in the story, even when I hadn't started it yet. That themes that matter to me, just about how we grieve and how we're defined by our good deeds in life, but how we're also defined by our mistakes. And the story by that point really mattered to me. The characters mattered to me. And the best thing I think that can happen to you as a fiction writer is that you start to feel a responsibility toward what you're working on, responsibility to the story and the characters. And I was there. So here's where all those years of writing and stewing and writing and moaning and churning out pages that didn't amount to anything, combined with the epiphany that I'd had on Snake Rock and my letting go of the idea of a prize. This is where my cathartic moment proved useful. I saw that I was going to attempt this novel not because I thought it was going to become a book, because I didn't. I truly did not think. I thought, I'll break this up at some point into stories or novellas or something. I'm just going to pursue it. But I'm going to do it because I enjoy putting words together. And no one was waiting for this novel whatsoever. Well, my agent was waiting for it, but she was waiting very patiently. No one was waiting for it. There was no contract for it. There was no deadline hanging in front of me. And if I wanted to, I could take the rest of my life to write this novel. And I practically did. I approached the omniscient narrator, just to be a little crafty again for a second. I thought, well, I got to gear myself up for this. So if I can do something in the first 3 pages that says to the reader, this narrator is going to go places where all the characters aren't. This narrator can just step out. If I can just make it happen early. And I ended up making it happen in the 2nd paragraph of the book, where I introduced the reader to 2 boys, and one of them is going to be one that you stick with, but the other one that you just met, the narrator then goes with that boy in the 2nd paragraph all the way out of Ohio and over to Europe, and because he's been drafted and is fighting in the war, and the reader sees him die. And the other boy that you met doesn't know that this has happened and hasn't seen it. And I did that, and I thought, I did it. Now what? It was like there was a tightrope running between Europe and Ohio. And I had just ran across it and did that, and then I ran all the way back and breathed a sigh of relief. And I thought, that's my contract with the reader. I have just made a contract, and now I'm just going to honor the contract. And for whatever reason, it was pretty easy after that. So anybody who's afraid out there, if there are any other people like me who are terrified of writing an omniscient narrator, just give it a shot. It was actually very fun and very easy, and it opened the book up just the way I wanted it to open up. I did not anticipate all the places that this story would take me. I did not anticipate going in that I would be writing about PTSD in American soldiers returning home from the war, or life on a Liberty ship in the South Pacific, or elements of social repression. I certainly did not anticipate that I would be writing scenes that involved seances, because that is also not my happy place as a writer. But you never know where the day is going to take you, and that's where the story took me. There are a few scenes in there where people are talking across the void into the dead. There are many scenes that I wrote because of the research that I did that I, of course, ended up taking out, and those were scenes that I polished and worked on for years. I made up the town, and I mentioned this a couple of days ago on stage. I made up the town of Bonamy, Ohio, because I didn't want to have to adhere to an actual place, and then spent the entire time worrying that the town I made up didn't feel like an actual place. And there was one scene that I worked on, and a good friend of mine read about 4 versions of it, and I said, how am I going to fix this scene? And she said, this scene is only in the book at this point because you wrote it. Right? I thought, oh, now I get it, and I'm going to take it out because it was the only justification for it being there. There was also a 50-page picnic scene. Can you imagine? I got it into my head that in the middle of the novel, it'd be really great to bring all the characters together into one scene for a picnic, because that would really impress everybody. And it grew. I spent 6 months of my life on that scene, and it's not in the book. 6 years after I started writing it, I was finished, and by finished I mean I'd gone through a few drafts and revised it, and then we finally sent it out, and it was accepted by Random House, and I worked with an editor who some of you have worked with here. She's legendary. Her name is Robin Desser, and she has edited some of the people who have been on the stage this weekend. She's old school. She's famous for her sharp eye. She's famous for very long editorial letters. Her average editorial letter to me was 11 single-spaced pages. And her letters were so long that they had letters of introduction. I'm not kidding. Like, there would be a letter to me that would sort of say, I love it. I think there's a lot of work to do. This, and this still don't work, but you can do it. And the editorial letter's attached. That wasn't the editorial letter. Our very first conversation, she let me know that she didn't think the second half was working. But I could tell that her enthusiasm was there, and I thought, all right, I'm in it. I trust you. And we embarked on this editorial journey that lasted for 2 years. Just to put it into a little bit of perspective, that is a long time for a novel to be accepted and then come out, 2 years. I had a good friend of mine whose novel was accepted at the same time that Buckeye sold. And her book came out a year later, and I still didn't have a publication date because we were still working on Buckeye. And a year after that, her book came out in paperback, and I don't think I had a publication date. How's this for a little lesson in humility? My assistant at work, his novel got accepted, his first novel, when Buckeye got accepted. We jumped up and down for joy. His book came out a year and a half later, a reasonable amount of time. I didn't have a pub date. His second book came out. His first book came out in paperback. His second book came out in hardback. My book was not out. But I trusted the process. I had to trust what had gotten me there, and I was trusting Robin and her instincts. She had no interest in letting the book go into production until it was the best that we could get it. And that always meant the best that I could get it, and she was just helping me get where I needed to be. And I'm very grateful for all of the heavy lifting that we did. It's really an amazing thing if you can work on a book for a long time and surround yourself with people who have more confidence in you than you have in yourself. That's really, really key. And she let me know which things to leave loose, which things to tighten up, and a whole lot of stuff to get rid of. There are a couple of characters in the book who make some arguably shocking decisions. And my take on writing villains, so to speak, villains in fiction, is that they rarely conceive of themselves as villains. And one of the beautiful things fiction can do is bring the reader along with the character and show you how that character sees the world and thinks, so that when you get to the point where the character is doing something unpleasant, something that you might never do, you at least understand how they got there and why they're doing it. And in that way, I think reading fiction flexes our empathy muscles. So all of which to say, I was very glad to have all the time that it took. In my most self-pitying moments, I had to drag myself back to the notion that I enjoy writing. I had to remind myself of that. I have written on a little card, index card taped next to my desk, in my own handwriting, "No one asked you to write." Which is really helpful, because it's just me talking to me saying, don't feel sorry for yourself. This isn't like something on your to-do list. You're choosing to do this. I'm grateful it didn't become a sport for me like tennis or football, actually. I'm grateful that writing does not wear out our joints and give us concussions. I'm grateful for all the steps in the publishing process that slowed me down and protected me from myself. And I'm really grateful that the publisher decided to get behind the book in such a wonderful way. I experienced for the first time this phenomenon of a whole lot of galleys going out. And when a whole lot of galleys go out, then a lot of people read the book before it's official. And when you get your galley, it's a little like a sonogram of your baby. You know, like people in your immediate circle look at it and they go, yeah, that's nice. I guess I got to read that one day, or I'll read it when it comes out. Kind of like a sonogram. Like, I'll appreciate your baby when it comes out. Like, but there are all these other people out there on Goodreads, this phenomenon of Goodreads, who are reading your galley and commenting on it. And so along with the woman who very helpfully told me that I'd gotten some details of the town that I made up wrong, my partner, Fred, who was the first review of the book that I got, where he was reading the galley. I wouldn't let him look at it until it was in galleys. And he was reading the galley, and he's about 2/3 of the way through, and I said, well, you can tell me, is it a slog? And he said, no, it's not a slog. And he's looking at it, and he looks at the back, and he looks at the price, and he says, you get your $30 worth. So I want to say that to all of you. You'll get your $30 worth. Just a couple of other gems from Goodread. You'll enjoy this as long as you're not in a rush. That was a good one. For anyone who wanted a little life to be slightly less trauma porn, but still bleak, this one is for you. And my favorite was, this is essentially boomer porn. I don't know if I can argue with that, but the boomer porn came out 2 weeks after I turned 60, and I feel like the luckiest person in the world to have this book out and to be able to stand up in front of you and tell you this, walk you through this story. And I'll just say in closing that quick little anecdote, way back to when I was 2 years into this book, in 2018, I was with a friend of mine in a little restaurant bar in New York City, and it was very crowded. And a young man and woman came in, and there were only 2 seats open in the whole place right in front of us. And they said, can we join you? And we said, sure. We started talking, and it turns out that this young man was a writer as well. And so I said, he asked me first. He said, what are you working on? And I said, a book I'm just never going to finish. What are you working on? He said, same. Then I said, he said, what's your book about? And I said, well, it's about a stupid novel about some people who live in Ohio, blah, blah, blah. And I said, what's your book about? And he said, it's a biography of James Baldwin. I got you applause from up here. Nicholas Boggs. So 7 years later, those 2 books came out within 2 weeks of each other, just by sheer chance, and we're both here. So there's so many great books out there, and I know you all have so many great books in your to-be-read pile. So if you get around to reading Buckeye, I want to say thank you in advance for that. And if you like it, I want to encourage you to write a letter to George Lucas and tell him what he missed out on. Thank you.